So in this month's Metabolic Stability, we really wanted to break down the common misconception of what movement patterns actually means to your training. So it's been commonplace now for people to talk about movement patterns, but really instead of talking about movement patterns, we talk about exercises. I'll give you a classic example. Something that I always try to talk about with coaches is a simple delineation between exercise and movement pattern, meaning what's the difference between a deadlift and a hip hinge? A deadlift is a hip hinge. A hip hinge doesn't have to be a deadlift. So when we talk about basically 7 core fundamental foundational movement patterns, we're talking about squat, hip hinge, upper body push, upper body pull. We're going to talk about lunging because it has direction, rotation, and gait. So probably the biggest one we misunderstand is gait. So G-A-I-T, not G-A-T-E, locomotion, walking, running, things like that. Things that make us uniquely human. So unfortunately what a lot of people do is they immediately assume gait training means carries. Now, carries is a type of gait training, right? But gait training doesn't have to be carries. I have to credit my lovely wife here, Jessica here. She got me to stop saying loaded carries because by definition, carries are loaded. But carries are a loaded version of gait, right? So, but gait can also be things like dead bugs, bird dogs, and we can even make an argument for things like side planks. And most of the other movement patterns that we just discussed are all elements that build into gait because gait is the most complex pattern and we tend to ignore it when it comes to training in the gym, even though it's the thing that makes us uniquely human. So what we want to do is take a moment to look at that aspect and use something so foundational like a dead bug, because when do you know when to load a gait pattern, right? When do you know that people walk well enough to place a load upon them? Most of us as fitness professionals, even strength coaches, don't have that skill set to understand what is a good gait pattern and to then know how to load it properly. So the nice thing about dead bug is the dead bug is basically a gait pattern in the most stable environment we can be in, which is on the ground, right? So if we have compensations in our dead bug, imagine what happens when we start placing load upon people during carries. So Jessica's going to demonstrate a couple of dead bugs here in the typical type position. Let's go ahead and just do a couple reps. So opposite arm and limb, how we move our arms and legs when we walk. And the whole goal is to keep the pelvis, what we call quiet, when we're doing it. Meaning that we shouldn't see elevation of the ribs or the belly getting big without loss of that neutral spine. And relax just. Now, if you give this to a lot of your clients, it's not a bad exercise, but a lot of them don't have the body awareness to know if they are creating that compensation with their pelvis or they're losing that core stability, of how to fix it. You keep telling them to put your ribs down or put your back down the ground are not cues that actually make them better. So what we're going to do is go through some progressions to teach you basically how to use load as a feedback tool to your client, because load can be one of the best teaching tools and it allows them to understand how to create proper tension, which is both stability and strength. And we're going to progress this from a foundational movement pattern being on the ground to some higher level variations. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to give a little feedback to the lower body. So Jessica is going to use a heavier mini band here, and she's going to place this above the knees. So Jessica's going to slide this on. So what we're going to do is give some feedback. So we're going to create a little push-pull action in the lower body. The same thing happens when we're walking or running, right? At the same time, we're going to use the ultimate sandbag. And the reason we're going to use the ultimate sandbag is I'm going to have her create tension. The tension is going to come in both horizontal and vertical loading. A lot of people ask me, can I use a band or something else to do this? Listen, you can try, but you're not going to get the gripping element. You're not going to create the tension in both horizontal and vertical, which are all big components of this exercise. So what I'm going to tell Jessica to do is grab the outside handles. So she's going to firmly grab her hands around. So we don't want to have what I call teacup fingers. The fingers popping off. We want a firm grip because grip is related to rotator cuff, and now it's start getting us into our lats and core. So she's going to go to the lower part of her sternum or the upper part of her stomach. Don't let it float up. And she's going to create what we call no saggy back. Lots of tension against the bag. We're going to keep a neutral wrist, not going to wrist extension. Now right now she's not going to move the bag, she's going to create that tension, she's going to lift her legs up, and she's going to slowly try to move one leg out as the other leg resists. Now I'm aiming for a vertical thigh here as she does the movement. So for a lot of your clients, this is going to be a great challenge in of itself, but it's also going to allow them to understand how to use core stability. Now the wonderful part too is this is a great pelvic alignment drill because the push-pulling action along with the tension sort of resets the body. So again, you go really slow. So if you're going to go really slow, you have to reduce repetitions. Usually like 5 each leg is quite a bit. You can't go really slow on 20 repetitions, not going to happen. So let's say we spend some time here. Let's add a little progression. So now we're going to add a little bit of the arm movement. The arm movement adds complexity to the exercise, so understand this takes a little patterning. So again, go really slow with it. Just because it's going to bring the weight up, create that same tension, legs up. Now as she moves one leg out, the bag is going to rotate. So she's bring one leg, the opposite arm is going to come out, and she's going to create that tension, 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 and then bring it back in. So again, she wants to pause at the end point, try to break the bag apart, and bring it back to the middle. One more time. Now she's doing a great job. She's only going about 45 degrees here, and relax just, because if we overturn, the goal is not to turn it as much as humanly possible. Then we lose the lat and we get into that upper trap and neck area, which is not what we want. We just want to create enough, sort of a diagonal patterning. If you can tell, we're going a bit lift and chop here, to create a chain reaction through the shoulder, core, and hip. The same way we're designed for locomotion. So we're starting to tap into some fundamental movement patterns of gait. So again, super important, super useful for your lot clients. We put this a lot of times in dynamic warm-up. Because it resets the pelvis, this makes everything else better. Lunging, squatting, pushing, pulling, jumping, running. Makes it all much better if we have a stable foundation with the pelvis. Now, we don't necessarily have to increase load, we can change range of motion. So again, this is going to be a bit more advanced. So again, work in the range of motion that your client feels comfortable with. If you demonstrate yourself moving to the furthest range of motion here, which I'll explain in a moment, your client's going to have to think they have to emulate the same. Start with very small ranges of motion and allow them to progress over time. So if we bring the weight back up just, legs back up, she's going to start with that rotation with the leg, and she's going to go just a little bit further. She's going to have diagonal, so now we have the lift into the motion. Bring it back, go the other side, and just go as far as she feels comfortable. She's still creating tension against the handles, still no sagging back. Last one just, and relax. So don't rush through these progressions. Allow your clients to practice. There's other ways to manipulate this exercise. For example, if we took the band off the lower body for a second, Jess. If your client is having either discomfort or they're compensating too much when you have the band around the body, then you can reduce the lever arm, take the band off, so we could do what are called simply heel drops. So just holding the band or the bag over the chest, we still want to load the upper body, that locks in that ribs, we go heel towards the ground. So you're getting someone using a lot of quad, or they can't help but compensate in the movement, or they're getting discomfort in their lumbar spine, shorten the range of motion. This is a great way to introduce dead bugs, the gait pattern to your clients. In a moment, we're going to show you some progressions that are going to allow you to really open up the playbook and get some good qualifications if your clients are ready for more progressive exercises like carries. So there's other progressions we can get to before we get to full standing, because again, standing is going to be your most complex environment because we have to navigate the most amount of gravity. That makes a big aspect of functional training is the navigation of gravity. Now, no one goes to the gym and goes, I'm going to nail out some navigation of gravity today, but it is how we learn to resist and produce force at the same time. It's how we develop fluid motions. It's how we work with balance, being able to keep our center of mass over our base support as we move with direction. So again, standing sounds simple, but it's not easy. So one of the things that we can do to help qualify people if they're ready to get into something like carries is this very simple action doing a march. The reason I like using the march is we're not really adding direction to our movement. We're using the fact that we're in a single leg environment. Because remember, in walking, we're about 60-70% of the time in single leg. So if we can't stabilize that single leg action in marching, imagine what happens when we add direction, and then unfortunately a lot of times add a load. So a simple march is basically going to look for my leg to get about parallel to the ground. I don't need to get into too much hip flexion. I'm not crunching down my torso. I'm not trying to set a world record. I can go less than that for people too, so we can build upon the range of motion. Generally what I want to do is be able to hold that for a 2 count. We're not going to hold this for 3 minutes or anything like that. Just to have that, make sure they own that position. One of the benefits in doing this is that when I lift one leg up, the other leg has to drive down. So what I'm learning is how to drive force to the ground to create stability through my body. Now, what we're going to do is go through a couple progressions with this. One is to simply take a band and we're going to add a row to it. So a couple things when we're doing this. Why are we doing a row? We're not trying to really strengthen your upper back. We're trying to take advantage of the fact that your lats work with your core and your glutes to create stability when you're walking. It's called your posterior oblique system. So when Jessica rows in, she's going to hold that tension, then she's going to start to march, okay, very slowly. Now, a couple things here. We want a
90-degree angle with that elbow, sort of think about your plank. If I take my plank and just bring it down, that's about where I want to be in my row. A lot of people get their hands up too high to their shoulder. So I want that tension first, I want to create that brace, then I'm going to slowly go into that march. So we're going to try to connect the chains and start to build that foundation to that gait pattern. So we're going to drive in, we're going to hold, so again, shoulders down, and then she's going to slowly, we're going to try to hold for that 2 count. Nice, Jess. So we're going to look for a locked leg on the leg that's still on the ground. And this is a nice way, again, planking, bracing, learning gait patterns. So we're teaching a lot of different qualities in a very simple drill. And relax. For something like this, we can do this for time. 30 seconds, we can work up to a minute. It's a nice way to sort of introduce these qualities because we're going to add complexity over time. So if we don't have this as a foundation, adding on more complex patterns is going to be very difficult to do in a very successful way. So now we're going to add something with a little bit more tension. So when we create a little bit more tension, we get a little bit more of that stability, but we're still going to try and create that chain. So we're going to start to load this a little bit more, but we're still doing this via connection. So again, something that Dr. McGill talks about is that strength is really that ability to create linkage through our chains. It's not just trying to isolate a muscle or create hypertrophy or stress that singular muscle, but to think about the sequencing of muscles, because most injuries happen because of lack of motor control, lack of sort of the organization of the muscles producing the motion. So how do we know if we're doing that? Well, doing more complex drills like this can definitely go a long way. So with the ultimate sandbag, what Jessica's going to do in a moment, she's going to get into what we call our front load position. Front load because we're thinking about front plank. So just like in a front plank, I create tension into the ground to create that brace. What I'm going to do with the ultimate sandbag is try to break it apart. So it's not just her holding the weight. So again, the tool matters here, that the reason we're putting the load here is to get that core tension, but then she's going to brace against it to integrate that lat. So if you let your elbows flare out, which is a very common error here, you're losing your plank. Once she gets in that position, she's set. She's going to go into her march, but now she's going to add a little T-spine rotation to the side that comes up. So we're starting to build that natural gait pattern. Now, be careful, it's just a little T-spine rotation because we're supposed to have mobility in our thoracic spine. We want stability in our lumbar spine. So the goal is not to rotate as far as you can, it's just to give a little rotation. So we want to keep the head forward because your body will follow your eyes. So Jessica, let's clean the weight up. See, her elbows are in towards her ribs, they're not too high, they're not out. Once she's set, she's going to go nice and slow. And add a little bit of T-spine rotation. So just a little bit, so I almost joke that you want to see the logo just deviating a little bit from that center. Okay, just keeping it nice and tight. Nice, just the last one. So a great drill to do is show that control, add a little bit more multi-planar fact. And the fact that when we walk, we actually create some rotation, right? When we use the opposites, we're creating some slight rotation in the body. That projects us forward because we're rotational beings. We're cylinders, right? If you throw, kick, punch, we all create rotation. That's how we create maximal efficiency through our movement. So in a moment, we're going to do our last drill, which is one of my favorites, but it's a very challenging drill. And this will give us a good baseline to see if your clients are prepared to do something more complex like carries. So what we're going to get into now is getting really into the reciprocal motion of the body. It's basically taking that idea of a push-pull. So we know like a push-pull, when we get in cable systems, we're getting a push-pull like this because, again, that's kind of how our body wants to work. Anyone that's been in fighting sports knows that when you create one punch, the next punch almost creates more power. It's the reason that we tend to go back before we go forward, things like swinging, throwing, and other type of rotational drills. So again, it's not about doing a chest exercise. It's not necessarily doing a back exercise. It's more of a core exercise. All right. So what we're going to use is both the lever bell and the band for two different reasons. So the lever bell will help us create a tight grip, and that grip will create shoulder stability and help us tap into that lat. All right. So when we're creating the press, we're trying to get here, lat and core, not into chest and shoulder. So it's a great opportunity to teach people how to press correctly too, and correct a lot of shoulder problems. And the wonderful thing about the lever bell is, obviously the lower we grab, the more demanding it is. So I like it better than a kettlebell bombs up because, let's face it, a kettlebell bombs up, as well intended as it is, doesn't really work well with a lot of clients. So if you need to choke up really high, that's fine. Over time here, even if you do it wrong, it's hard to create a problem in the shoulder and make it uncomfortable. The thing you want to make sure, though, is that you don't lose that 90-degree angle. At the same time, she's going to create a pull with the band. So again, she's going to create that row in, and basically we're getting against that lat from the other side. So first we're going to do it without a leg movement. She's going to just practice the push-pull.
So even if you just want to use this as a core drill, it's a fantastic core drill and starts to teach this sort of idea that we're a cylinder when we create motion. Once it gains proficiency, then we can add it to the leg movement. Now, if people are going to fixate which leg, I don't know if it really matters. So we're just going to pattern one side. Again, trying to create that tight grip on both sides and just have ownership. Now, see how she's getting a lockout on that lever belt? We need a lockout. She stops short of lockout. We're not getting into that lat. We're going to stay in the shoulder, which is what we don't want to have happen. So this is a really fun drill. It's really challenging. We've had a lot of professionals go through this and they're surprised how hard this is, even though they've been doing things like carries for quite some time. So again, it's getting an idea, how are we qualifying people for more complex exercises and realizing, even though walking sounds so fundamental to what we do, that if you break down the complexity of the movement, there's so much to it, right? In gait, there's probably 6 to 8 phases of gait. And when you think about most exercises, there's not that many moving parts. Even something as complex as a get-up can't even match to what's happening when we're in gait, or even more challenging when we're actually running. So again, these are ways to build a progression so we can stop guessing and feeling more confident that we know when people are ready for these good movement patterns and focusing on movement patterns and not just exercises.